Okay, keeping us on time with today's agenda because we have a lot of good sessions in store for you for the rest of this afternoon. Before we begin our legislative update, I would like to thank RTI International for their sponsorship of this legislative update session. I also thank them for their team's help with running this conference. They are helping us provide some of the breakout sessions that you're getting to experience both yesterday and today. And we appreciate their ongoing collaboration to support our school leaders in school law and policy development. RTI coordinates the large district consortium, and they are NCASA's constant partners in much of the advocacy work that we pursue daily on behalf of all school leaders. RTI also offers some key support services for school districts, and here to share a brief mention of some of those services is Dr. Angela Quick, RTI's Vice President for Education Workforce Development. Angela, welcome.
Thanks, Katherine. And again, I promise to be brief, but I just want to have the opportunity to thank NCASA for the partnership, Katherine, for your friendship as well. And just quickly, a little bit about RTI. We are Research Triangle Institute, not responsiveness to instruction. We're trying to help others understand that RTI stands for the Research Triangle Institute, or in RTP. We are a global nonprofit, and our mission is to improve the human condition. And we believe that we can improve the human condition by using scientific rigor and technical expertise in a variety of disciplines. We are invested in laboratory sciences, engineering, but also in some of the social sciences, one of which is education. And I am one of the leaders of the Education and Workforce Development Division. And we work in a lot of schools, a variety of schools in North Carolina and also in other states. We partner with educators to improve instruction, assist with change management. We also do strategic planning and financial planning for districts. But in addition to that, Education Workforce Development Division works in large-scale federal educational surveys for the United States Department of Education. We conduct research, policy-relevant research, and then we also have an area that focuses on data visualization tools and communication aspects for a variety of stakeholders. I'd like to explain what we do by saying most practitioners know why they need to change or why things need to improve or scale. Researchers know the what, and our team at RTI, as we are former practitioners, we add value and assist and support you by translating the how. So the research expertise that we have at RTI, we utilize that in all of our assistance and support for districts. And we squarely believe that we assist and help you with translating the how and the implementation. And then finally, just a quick glance at some of the services and capabilities. I mentioned the technical assistance. We do also offer grant support, grant writing, program design, and implementation, especially if you're looking at local, state, or federal grants. Evaluation, program evaluation. I mentioned the survey, data collection, and then the technology. So in closing, again, I would just like to say thank you, Katherine. Thank you, NCASA, for partnering with us. And if you're ever in need of our assistance or support, please feel free to reach out. And one last closing thing. I know you've been thanked. Everyone is thanking you for the resiliency and persistence and the hopefulness that you're giving everyone through this pandemic. But as a former educator, always feels I'm still an educator. I just want to thank all of you for your tenacity, your persistence, and your hope that you've given society in general. So thank you. Over to you, Katherine.
Thank you, Angela. So now we are going to be diving into our legislative update, and joining me for that segment is my partner in crime, so to speak, Elizabeth Yelverton. who is our legal affairs and policy manager. And I say this to a lot of people, Elizabeth is the attorney who keeps me out of trouble. So
It's not an easy job.
I desperately need that. But thank you, Elizabeth, for your support and your advocacy for our school leaders. So we're going to be sharing a bit with you this morning about what's happening in our General Assembly on many of the topics that we know are right in front of you in your school districts and your schools. So Elizabeth, bring up our slide deck and we'll get rolling. Okay, let's move right on.
Okay, sorry, hang on.
And go to we'll do just a quick session overview to see kind of what we're going to be covering this morning. If we get our technology to cooperate, which is always challenging. There we go. Okay, so just a brief introduction of what we're going to be covering this morning. We wanted to break down the happenings of the General Assembly in terms of the priorities that that our board of directors adopted as the work plan for our legislative goals and priorities for the year. And those come in 5 key areas that you see there. We're going to dive in a bit into each of those. And Elizabeth and I are going to be splitting those up. And she's going to kick us off first with a bit about political climate, the context under which we work in the General Assembly and with other state agencies to try to advance these goals and priorities. And then we're going to be wrapping up at the end, trying to address the questions that you have. So as Elizabeth and I go through the presentation over the next hour, please drop your questions into the chat box. And one of us will try to answer some as we go along to save time. But if we don't get to those during the actual comments, then we'll try to wrap up with a Q&A at the end. So with that, Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, great. Thanks, Katherine. As Katherine mentioned, I'm going to start us off today by talking about the political climate and a little bit more about our priorities. So just so we all know where we're at right now, it's been an interesting year working with the legislature. It always is, but it's like now on top of everything else, we have a global pandemic that's still going on. So Katherine and I have actually been meeting a lot with legislators via Zoom and, you know, really seeing a lot of legislators struggle with a lot of the technology issues that we're working with. So you're not alone. Even our state leaders, sometimes we've got to remind them to unmute. But just so that we all know, who the key players are right now. So we still have pretty much the same leadership that was around the last cycle. We have the Speaker of the House, Tim Moore, a Republican, the President Pro Tem, Senator Phil Berger, also a Republican. But then we also have Governor Cooper, who is able to maintain his seat, and he is a Democrat. So that actually makes North Carolina one of 11 states that actually has Republican-controlled legislatures with a Democratic governor. And just why is that important? That's important because the governor retains the veto power. So that you can see that's why I have that little icon there, just to remind you that he does have that power. And back in 2017, when Governor Cooper first took office, he did take office, but it was with Republican supermajorities. So in the House, they had, a super majority, you need at least 72. And with in the Senate, you need at least 30 members of the Senate to have that super majority, which Republicans did have when he first took office. So just for reference, from 2017 to 2018, the governor actually vetoed 28 bills, and 23 of those were overridden. So only 5 were not overridden, and those were sent back to, I think, like the Rules Committee, where a lot of legislation goes to die. Now compare that to 2019, when Republicans lost the supermajority. That was the first session after that. From 2019 to now, the governor has vetoed 26 bills, and none have been overridden so far. So that just shows you the difference between having a supermajority and a regular majority. And that is that you really have to come up with a more bipartisan process and more tug and pull on both sides. And that's kind of what you saw this week with the reopening schools legislation. The legislature did pass Senate Bill 37, which would reopen schools, but it didn't have everything that the governor felt was necessary. So that was vetoed, and then that override attempt was not successful. So that's why, as of this week, and Katherine's going to get into this more, we have a more bipartisan, more of a bargained for final result, which can actually be very good in places that are very diverse, like North Carolina, where you do have people on both ends of the political spectrum that have to work together to advocate and advance our goals as a state. So how does that affect our priorities or our major goals? You saw this slide at the beginning, but I just wanted to go a little bit more into what each of these mean. And you might notice that a lot of these has similar language to what you might have seen in articles about the Leandro case, or maybe the Department of Public Instruction or the State Board of Education. They use similar language. And that is because we really do work hand in hand with a lot of these entities to make sure we're on the same page for what we're advocating for. And, you know, seeing if we can share our priorities and advocate for you guys. And that's always going to have more of an impact if we can get other entities on board on the team. So you have stuff like additional COVID-19 relief and recovery. Obviously, that's still going to be a top concern as long as this pandemic is ongoing. And in that, you have things like COVID funding and waivers and reopening legislation. Effective measurement of school and student success. You're going to have things like testing and accountability, excellent educators and support staff for every student. You're getting into things like your recruitment and retention efforts, and then adequate and equitable resources. Again, that's like a reference to Leandro and making sure that our schools have all the funding outside of COVID-19 even that they need to be successful. And lastly, our efficient operations and safe learning environment. That's going to focus on local control, things like calendar flexibility, which is kind of a naughty word nowadays, but we'll get into that a little bit more. And also things like student safety and mental health, which is continues to be a big issue with COVID. So with that being said, we kind of want to actually see if we can incorporate some technology right now and see how you guys are feeling about these priorities and what is your top concern. And we do realize that this is not all encompassing, but just to see how you guys are feeling.
So select an option and we'll let you know the results as we move forward.
And this is a new feature for us too. We want to make things as interactive as possible. So hopefully technology will be on our side today. All right, Karen, can you show the results?
They're still voting. We have about 50%. 50% of our attendees have voted. So let's see if we can up it just a little bit.
Okay.
And we will share the results. Okay.
All right, so this is actually a little different than I thought. I thought there would be a little bit more for COVID relief and recovery, but you guys seem to be really drawn towards testing and accountability and recruitment. Well, it's really close actually. So, but yeah, definitely testing and accountability, and that's understandable because it is getting to be that time.
'Tis the season.
Is the season.
Thank you all for voting, and we'll have other poll options throughout the rest of the presentation.
We will, so thank you.
So let's move forward and roll right into our COVID relief and recovery segment, which I'm going to try to share with you a bit about this morning. So Elizabeth, if we can go on to the first topic, which is what's happening with efforts in the General Assembly to reopen more schools in North Carolina. So as Elizabeth mentioned, we had legislation previously, Senate Bill 37, that had been vetoed because there were some concerns in the governor's office about some of the components of that previous legislation that sought to make sure more of our schools were offering in-person instruction. The main holdups in that legislation had been, from the governor's perspective, he had been concerned about an effort to allow middle and high school students to return under Plan A with minimal social distancing within classrooms. And so that was a health concern he raised about that legislation. His other concern had been that the previous legislation, Senate Bill 37, took away his authority and local authority to close schools for the remainder of the year on a widespread basis. For instance, a statewide order closing schools like he issued last spring. He would have been prohibited from doing that had that legislation become law. And as governor of the state, he wanted to retain the authority to make sure safety could be maintained throughout all of our schools statewide. So with those objections, he vetoed the legislation. It was attempted as an override in the Senate, and they fell one vote short of being able to override the governor's veto. So that put all of our state leaders sort of at the bargaining table to work out a compromise agreement. That compromise emerged just earlier this week. It actually was rolled out, I believe, on Tuesday. And the new legislation was put into Senate Bill 220, which is the Reopening Our Schools Act. And to show you how quickly things can move whenever there's agreement among all the parties that are the key stakeholders, the House and Senate leadership and the governor, when they all agree, this thing was actually moved through both chambers of the General Assembly and signed into law yesterday. So it is law already. So we have new law on reopening our schools. And here's a bit about what it does. So this new law, first of all, will require all of our elementary schools that are K-5 to operate under Plan A, which is the requirement for minimal social distancing. You don't have to maintain 6 feet of distance, but you can have more of your students in a classroom. You have to move under that reopening Plan A no later than 21 days from when the bill was signed into law. So from yesterday, March 11th, that means by April 1st, all of our elementary K-5 schools across the state need to have moved under Plan A for operations. And we know that sets up some work for some of you out there in our districts. If you're not in Plan A now with your elementary schools, then that's certainly something that you and your leadership team at the central office and within the school buildings need to be working toward with your Board of Education very quickly to put all the plans in place to make this feasible. And one caveat there, you have to be in compliance with that by April 1st. You can go ahead and move to that if you are ready, and there's nothing that prohibits you from going ahead and moving forward with getting K-5 in Plan A prior to April 1. The same holds true with the next component of this legislation, which is the law now allows grades K through 6 to operate in either Plan A, Plan B, or a combination of those two plans, and that is for the rest of the school year. There are some caveats, though, if you want to move your K-6 students into Plan A. First of all, you have to put together a plan of how you're going to operationalize that, how you're going to ensure safety of these older students. And you have to submit that plan to the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS. We have not seen this yet, but we understand that there's collaboration between DHHS and DPI to put together some sort of template to allow you to report in on your plans. But note here that DHHS cannot veto your plan on how you're going to move grades 6 through 12 to Plan A if you're going that route. It's really just for their monitoring and information, the plan that you're submitting to them. They may offer suggestions to you, but they cannot reject your plan. A second component and requirement is that if you move grades grades 6 through 12 to Plan A, then you have to agree to enter into the ABC collaborative that is operated by Duke University, so they can do data monitoring on the students that you have in Plan A and the staff affected by this switch to Plan A. And the idea there is that the state will be collecting data through the science collaborative and then looking at that, and they can help determine if there's a need for additional closures, if we see any kind of outbreak ultimately occur. We hope that doesn't happen, but it's sort of a safety protocol that the state has put in place with this monitoring of 6 through 12 students that have not been allowed to operate in Plan A previously this school year. The governor will retain the ability, as I noted, to be able to close schools this year. He can't, under this law, shut down all schools with one executive order like he did previously last spring. But if he sees within a district that there's an outbreak that he's concerned about and the district and the board is not moving to shut down schools in that area, he can certainly do a district by district shutdown to maintain safety of our schools, staff, and students. So other components of this legislation, all of our schools must provide a Plan A option for grades 6 through 12 students who are exceptional children with an IEP or either a Section 504 plan, but that is if the parents request that. So it's not a widespread, you have to have all EC students in Plan A if they're in middle or high school, but if the parents want them to be in person, you have to make that option available. You also have to continue providing a remote only option for students, which is Plan C, for the remainder of the year for those families that request that and want to have their child educated only in remote instruction. And you have a little bit of flexibility that's been built in here to allow you to reschedule the teacher work days that you have in your adopted calendar to move some of those into the next 21 days to help with your planning for any shifts you might be making with any of your students for the remainder of this year. So that is something that you can do is shift some of your teacher time so that you have more time to work together on getting ready to roll. I'll say that since this is a new law, hot off the press yesterday, we have gotten a lot of questions, and those have been coming in statewide from superintendents and others about, can I do various options under this legislation? So I'll just tell you a bit about some of the main questions we've gotten. Do I have to wait 21 days to move plans? The answer is no. Now that we have a law, you can go ahead and move if you are ready. The second one, can I continue 4 days a week in Plan A for either elementary, or can I take my middle or high school to Plan A for 4 days a week? And the answer to that right now is yes. The law is silent on defining days that must be in person. It just requires you to offer in-person instruction. And Plan A merely, the DHHS guidance merely talks about restrictions related to seating and buses. Those are the difference in Plan A, Plan B. They don't define number of days that must be conducted in person in classrooms. However, we do know, based on conversations that our state superintendent had just yesterday with local superintendents around the state, she requested feedback on a proposal that the State Board of Education is now working on to address in an emergency session on Monday. The state board is considering a policy to require that Plan A be a minimum of 4 days a week, so that we wouldn't have any schools thinking they are meeting the requirements of Plan A by going 2 or 3 days a week. The proposal is a minimum of 4 and allowable for 5 days. We do expect to see that emerge from our State Board of Education on Monday. We will be following that and, of course, sharing about it in our updates and our newsletter next week. Another question that we continue to get a lot is the key for each decision that your LEA has ahead of you on whether you're going to switch plans with any of your grade levels, you really want to think about what are the transportation options, and we've had many questions on those. We are hearing at this point that DHHS is not planning to change its toolkit guidance on transportation rules that are in effect for either Plan A or Plan B. But just know if you're moving middle and high school students to Plan A, you have the transportation rules for Plan A versus what you've had to do with limits under Plan B for those same students. So that may be more flexibility. Also, since you can mix your plans, you could possibly choose to go Plan A for 612 only for transportation and continue 6-foot minimal social distancing, a Plan B operation within your classroom. So it's sort of a mixed combination there. All of that, of course, is up to you at the local level, and you just need to detail what you're going to do with 612 if there's any Plan A component that you're building in to the schedule you're putting in place for those students. So I think that will kind of get us a good introduction to the new law. There are some related pieces on the next slide, which of course we saw, as I mentioned, Senate Bill 37 was vetoed. So that one is now a moot point. There were alternatives to Senate Bill 37 filed ahead of this compromise emerging this week in Senate Bill 220. There was discussion this week on House Bill 90, which is a local bill that had mirrored Senate Bill 37. That had been for 14 counties only. Given that we have the new law in place, we don't expect that to have to move forward at this point. The related item, though, on school transportation changes contained in House Bill 193 may be something that we do see move forward. This legislation actually gained full House support just yesterday. And what it would do is, in the absence of any changes that are happening with the DHHS toolkit on reopening guidance and transportation rules, this would allow students who are on the same bus, if you have Plan A and Plan B students on the same bus, those students would follow the seating limits for their individual plan. The current requirement for DHHS is that you must use the most restrictive plan. So now you're having to follow a Plan B if you're mixing those grade levels and plan levels on the same bus. This would provide a little more flexibility and maybe an added piece that could help facilitate many of your efforts to move to more of your schools being open and for in-person learning. So we'll continue to follow that one and keep you posted. Okay, so another topic under COVID relief. The next area, of course, has been a big piece of legislation that came out of our state house already and is now sitting in the Senate, and that is pertaining to mandatory summer school. House Bill 82, the summer learning choice for North Carolina families. If it ultimately becomes law, you would be required to put a plan in place for how you're going to operate a mandatory summer program. You would need to submit that 30 days before the last instructional day of 2020-21. We know the time for that is creeping up on us. It's coming very quickly. So we have heard that the bill sponsors in the House would love to see this completed by the end of March to give you adequate time to create these plans, submit those, and get ready and geared up for what you might be offering this summer. Some of you may be thinking, we already plan to offer summer school, so why is this legislation even necessary? We get that question a lot. What we heard from state House members, and this was championed by House Speaker Tim Moore, as well as the education chairs of the House, with Representative Jeffrey Elmore of Wilkes County running the legislation. Their goal is to make sure that the offering this summer is more robust than a typical summer program might be. And so they felt in all of our students coming out of lost in-person instruction time, they needed a more extensive offering this summer to help them build back into a normal learning environment for the coming school year. And so this is what they see as important in passing in legislation. The legislation started out with a very prescriptive mandate that the program for the summer had to be 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for a 6-week period after the current school year ends. And we were getting a lot of concerns from many of you about how in the world can we make that work? That's very prescriptive. How will we get families to participate? And how will we find staff to make it feasible? So we at NCASA worked to try to get that changed, and we were thankfully successful in efforts with other advocates in making sure that the House heard those concerns, and they have changed the legislation so that it now does not require that prescriptive 6-week mandate. It instead is written to require 150 hours of instruction or 30 days, and that has to occur after the current school year ends. It can't be tacked on as an extension of the current school year. Now, with that, that still sounds like a 6-week program, which it is. The beauty of that, though, is that we believe there may be some flexibilities in how you would put this program together. There are a couple of changes that we need to get in place as this bill moves through the Senate to really make those feasible for you. First of all, within the legislation, the bill has an August 1st ending date, and that is written in the section pertaining to how you will staff your summer program. So it's put at the end of the section where it says you must use temporary employees and issue contracts for them for the period that you're running this program. And those contracts, the way this date is placed, would end on August 1st. That was a drafting error that we have been able to draw to the attention of the bill sponsors, and we have gotten their commitment that this will change when the Senate takes up this legislation. The House sponsors are pursuing that fix. And they intended that the August 8th deadline only apply to a provision allowing you to rehire retired teachers with only a minimal sit-out rather than the mandatory now ongoing 6-month sit-out required before they can come and work in your summer program as a temp employee. So that date will be moved only to that provision, allowing your employment contracts to continue. The second date in the bill that needs to change, there was a study reporting requirement for LEAs put at the end of the legislation, and that is written to say that you must report by September 1st on program completion and testing of students who participate within the summer program. That signifies that was the intent there, is you have to wrap up your program in the month of August so you can report no later than 9/1 on program completion. And so we have asked that that be extended all the way into the end of the current semester. I'm sorry, at the end of the first semester of the coming school year in January. We were not successful in getting any commitment on that, but we do think we have some headway, and that the bill sponsors may move the date sometime into October to allow you to complete your summer program in the first quarter of the coming school year, and you could set up your remaining hours as either before school or after school. And note, the caveat here is none of that is possible unless we get the date changes that I've just talked about. So it's really important that we are working toward getting these things corrected as this legislation goes through its next phase, which should be in the Senate Education Committee, possibly even next week. And we may be asking for your help in reaching out to folks and urging that these changes occur so that you have the flexibility you need to finish your program into the new school year if you think that's the best approach. Other parts of the bill, students who have to be served, you need to give enrollment priority to students defined as at risk. Funding, there is no new funding provided in this legislation itself. You're to use existing funds that you have through ESSER 2 or any other source of funding like your at-risk money or your reading camp money that you have for the current year. But note also a separate piece of legislation, House Bill 196, that was just signed into law yesterday, ultimately sets aside $40 million for this summer program, and that is going to be doled out with priority given to those who've already been operating with more of your students in person. So if you've spent more of your COVID relief money, you will get a larger share of this summer learning money to help with this plan. So that is something that may be coming your way as an offset to some of the costs you might experience. For your program, you have to also include transportation for participating students, provide a meal each day of the program, and a physical activity. So if you're operating as before or after school, finishing this up in the new year, you would need to at least provide a snack and a recess period to cover those, and then of course provide transportation. None of those components are in the minimum hours requirement if you are using the hours calculation. You have to offer grade level course offerings to all of the students with specifics for K-3, focusing on literacy and math, and then science with our upper grades, as well as credit recovery hours for our high school students and others who really may have missed the boat on passing grades for some of the courses they need to move on toward graduation. And last but not least, if kindergarten students are participating in this program, they cannot be retained. They get to go ahead and move on up to first grade in the coming school year, but all of our principals will have the right to look at and reassess each of the students other than kindergartners participating in the summer program and ultimately determine promotion or retention for each of those students. So a lot there, still a lot to come as this legislation continues to move forward, and we'll keep you posted on developments as they occur. Now, just a quick bit about COVID funding that has already been considered by our General Assembly this year. We have new law, Senate Bill 36, which moved earlier this year to really formalize the $1.6 billion in ESSER 2 funding that was sent down to all public school units from the federal government. So that all has to be spent by 2023. And of course, there are specific restrictions and operating guidelines for each allotment that this is allotted to. Other pieces of the bill, it did extend the extra credit grant program for parents. Some who missed the deadline earlier, just for whatever reason, they were able to go ahead and apply through May 31st to get those checks. And then something that sort of took our finance officers by surprise, this legislation changed the rules midstream about the Office for Pandemic Recovery being able to reallocate unexpended federal relief funds. And now suddenly that flexibility was tightened, and those funding changes between allotments now cannot occur. So we know many of our finance officers scrambled to be in compliance with that and get everything moved in advance of the law changing on when they can move funds. A second piece of legislation, and this one became law just yesterday, House Bill 196. That is dealing with some of the federal relief money that was retained by the Department of Public Instruction. So this legislation specifically allocates over $145 million of the department's share of the ESSER 2 funding, and outlines how all of that has to be expended. And it really leaves only about $15 million for the department in discretionary funding to address statewide needs related to pandemic relief. But some of the key pieces of how that will be utilized, we're going to see additional funding that will go out under instructional support allotment to provide contracting for those key support personnel, additional funding into cybersecurity. I mentioned the $40 million for summer learning. A lot of those are being put in place, but some new initiatives that are important to our state superintendent, like funding for $12 million in funding for a program called Letters, which is tied to the science of reading. and a whole initiative that the state superintendent is leading to try to revamp Read to Achieve and have it be more focused on the science of reading. So some key supports for initiatives that she is championing. We'll see some of that develop along the way. So that's pretty much it for funding. And again, more specifics on all of this will come from our State Board of Education and DPI and guidance on how each of these allotments will operate. Many of you have heard about what happened just yesterday with the president signing of the new federal relief package, which may give us ESSER 2, and we think that's what it will be. I mean, ESSER 3, that's what it ultimately will be called. It's a massive $1.9 trillion relief package, one of the largest probably ever in history. In fact, back since the Affordable Care Act is the biggest piece of federal legislation since that time. It does outline $170 billion for reopening schools, with $130 billion of that for K-12, the rest going to higher education. And it includes a key piece, 20% of that will be earmarked for summer enrichment and after school programs. So a big focus from the federal government as well as our state government on summer recovery efforts for our students. Something else to think about with this legislation, there's been a lot of discussion about how this will really attempt to address the poverty issue for many of our children around the nation. And what we're hearing is that it's a historic move. It will lift more than 4 million children above the poverty line, cutting the number of children in poverty by more than 40%. That is astronomical and can make a huge difference in the learning experience those children bring into our classrooms every day. So it's a huge piece for them and something that we look forward to seeing how this plays out in implementation and addressing the needs of those children. So moving on, to be mindful of our time. So the last segment I want to talk about under COVID response, we have a lot of interest in our General Assembly about getting more spectators into sporting events at our schools, as well as it's graduation season. People want to see their kids graduating this spring. So all of that's on the minds of parents, and it's certainly resonating with legislators. We have many bills already moving in our General Assembly. Several of those are statewide. And then we have some local bills as well. The statewide bills, we have House Bill 128 that would allow for a 50% capacity of spectators at all indoor and outdoor events at our schools or colleges. That's a really big number. It's very different than what we have under the current rule, which recently was updated by Governor Roy Cooper. Current limit is 30% limit at most events if they're outdoors, and 15% for larger indoor events. So a very, very big difference there in what our legislators are pushing for. That came from Representative Kyle Hall of Stokes County, and it has crossed over to the Senate and having gained support of the full House. On the Senate side, statewide bill, Senate Bill 116, would focus only on outdoor sports, and this would either be at public or non-public high schools. And it would allow capacity limits of 40% of spectators at those events, and things like soccer games or events held on fields where people bring their own lawn chairs and sit outside at these events, those would not count in that 40% limit. So that legislation has passed the Senate, moved over to the House, and just awaiting to see which of those lawmakers decide to move forward with. And the concern being, will the governor veto either of these if they got to his desk, because they are a statewide bill and he has that authority? So something that has been attempted, and we're seeing more of this resonate in the General Assembly, there now are multiple local bills seeking to pull in opportunities within 14 counties identified in each of those different bills, the Students, Parents, Community Rights Act. Each of those 4 bills would apply to 14 counties, and they're all really different counties. I think we could have up to 50 counties or so affected by local bills that could circumvent any veto by the governor and address additional spectator options for sporting events at schools. So if ultimately lawmakers don't feel that they can get around the governor's objections on increasing capacity at sporting events and graduations, they may go the route of moving these local bills instead. We're continuing to watch each of those, and we'll keep you posted as anything else happens with them. So stay tuned to our updates on that. So I think that brings us to the end of the COVID response segment. We're going to hear now from Elizabeth a bit about our human capital segment.
I'm muted. Okay, so Katherine just did a great job of covering a lot of the legislation that has been front and center in our lives and you guys' lives over the past few weeks. But now we're going to try to shift kind of outside the COVID realm, if you can even think of that, by discussing some of the legislation that's been filed relating to recruitment and retention of our educators. So you can see here that there's actually been quite a few filed so far, and there's probably actually some that I could have added to this presentation that have just been filed this week. But we do have a lot that mimics a lot that you see in our legislative priorities. So things like raising the minimum wage for non-certified school employees and restoring master's pay for certain educators. Both of those haven't really progressed anywhere in the legislature so far. They're in the Senate Rules Committee, which is where a lot of great legislation goes to die. But as I mentioned before, it's still a Republican-controlled legislature. So a lot of bills will be sent to the Rules Committee, and then Republican leadership will determine whether it needs to be taken out and actually will see the light of day, as I like to say. So, you know, a lot of these bills, take it with a grain of salt. Just because it's been filed, unfortunately, doesn't mean that it's going to happen, or in some cases, fortunately, means it's not going to become law. But we did just want to put these on your radar so that you guys know that what has been proposed at least. I did want to point out House Bill 71, the Living Donor Protection Act. That's kind of an interesting one. And that one actually has passed the House Health Committee. So that one's kind of gotten out of the trenches and actually made its way through a committee. That would provide insurance protections and tax credits up to $5,000 and paid leave for people who are live organ donors, aka they are an organ donor, or they maybe donate bone marrow. That would provide them with some extra protections and benefits. There's another bill, as you can see, that would restore medical benefits for retirees. And if that bill was passed, that would be retroactive to December 31st, 2020. So you wouldn't have any of our employees who retire on or after January 1st of this year losing those medical benefits, which we know is very important for recruitment and retention, and also just recognizing the great work that our educators do and making sure that they are still getting those benefits when they retire. There are also just a couple of tax and retirement bills, and you'll actually see a few more of those in the slides ahead when I talk about what the state health plan and retirement board has proposed. But yeah, you can just see some of the legislation that's been proposed so far. Okay, and now we're going to try to incorporate a poll. So these are all of the or some of the proposals that are actually from our legislative priorities that have actually been introduced, as I just mentioned, in the legislature. So it would be interesting to see which one of these would have the most positive impact in your school. I know we want to select all of them, but. And I did just want to mention the $15 hour wage. We are actually, NCASA is proposing a phase-in approach. So the LEAs wouldn't be hit with, okay, you have to immediately start paying $15 an hour right off the bat, because we have heard a lot of member feedback just saying, this is going to be really hard if we can't phase into it. And, you know, especially with COVID and funds being a little tight. So let's see. Okay. So the majority of you think restoring master's degree pay for educators would make the most positive impact in your schools. And then we've got medical benefits in second, and then $15 hour wage coming in third. But I know a lot of you would like to see all three of those, and we would too. Katherine, do you want to say anything? Okay. All right, so moving right along, I'm not going to go over all of these bills because I want you guys to come back after lunch. And I feel like if I were to elaborate on any of these bills, you might just, I don't know, leave the state entirely. The retirement system and the state health plan, the Treasury Department, I should say, has introduced a lot of legislation, probably more than any other agency. And there were some bills that caused us a little bit of pause last year, just relating to healthcare providers and that sort of thing. So we will definitely be keeping a close watch on all of these and letting you guys know in our newsletters and weekly communications if there's anything that, you know, we need you to voice your support or your thoughts about. I know we are running short on time, so I'm not going to get into this, but this is very important if you're working with licensure. The Human Capital Roundtable has been a group, like a collaborative group that's been kind of working behind the scenes this past year with the Southern Regional Education Board, SREB, and they're redesigning different pathways to licensure in North Carolina. So the whole idea would be to creating multiple avenues for beginning teachers or people that are interested in maybe moving into the teaching profession. So we're not just under this straight, you must go to an EPP or you're a, you know, lateral entry residency teacher. It's creating a lot more different pathways, a lot of incorporating micro-credentials and advanced teaching roles, and that sort of thing. And I do know that Pepsi has recently created these licensure reform subcommittees to kind of expand on a lot of these proposals. So you've got like the preparation and entry subcommittee, the licensure subcommittee featuring our own executive director, Katherine Joyce, the professional learning subcommittee, and the budget and compensation committee. So definitely keep an eye on Pepsi and the state board just to see how they're going to be handling these proposals in the future. All right, and then handing it back to Katherine.
Okay, moving right along and into a favorite topic of you all, accountability and testing. And so we really have only seen one piece of legislation filed so far dealing with our school performance grades, and that's House Bill 152, which would split the compilation of the grades into two pieces, one for performance and one for growth, rather than merging them into one as we see now, with growth counting for only 20% of that total. So this is something that may be just sort of laying the groundwork for ongoing discussions around changes to testing and accountability. We've had a whole set of recommendations that a Superintendents Association task force has been working on for many, many months. And they are now connecting with our state superintendent and a task force that she's putting together to outline where we are going next in accountability and testing reform. I'm not going to cover that and steal the thunder from this afternoon's breakout session that will be led by Superintendents Association President, Dr. Patrick Miller, along with our Champion for Children co-recipient, Dr. David Stegall. They will be talking all about the short-term goals and long-term goals for accountability and testing reform, and can tell you where we are in that process and what some of those key recommendations are. So you may want to tune into that session at 1 o'clock today in our breakouts. So moving on, you did hear a bit this morning from our state superintendent about her goals for testing and accountability. So let's, and I think for the sake of time, let's skip doing the polling because we're running a little short on time.
Yeah,
So you heard from the state superintendent about her vision for remodeling our school accountability system. This is something that she shared with our legislature just this week. And in addition to the profile of a graduate that you saw from her earlier today, some of the components that she's thinking might be good to roll into this accountability system as multiple measures of how to grade our school's success, academic achievement and growth, K-3 readiness, closing the achievement gap, our graduation rates, career college readiness, all of these components, reducing discipline. All of these could be new measures to identify how our schools are actually performing rather than just basically mostly based on one test taken on one day and time. So stay tuned to see what comes forward from this. And again, you may hear more about this in the breakout this afternoon with Drs. Miller and Stegall. Okay, moving on, and I'll turn it back to Elizabeth to talk about our next two priority areas with equitable resources and then efficient and safe operations for our schools.
All right. So pretty quickly, I just want you guys to be aware of the budget process because outside of COVID, we still have to have a state budget and sometimes. So I wanted to point out that these bills so far, Senate Bill 105, 106, 107, they've all been filed, but nothing's been done yet. So that's just kind of legislators meeting that bill filing deadline and giving you a heads up that, hey, we might be filling in with some budget items as this process continues. There have been joint appropriation meetings being held since February 17th, and those are slated to go on through the 23rd. We think that the governor's budget will come out soon around the end of the month. And that's really like the starting piece to get the ball rolling for both the chambers to then come up with their proposals and working off of, the governor's budget. In addition to that, we are having ongoing school bond coalition meetings because our schools still have all of these facility needs, at least $8 billion in outstanding school capital needs the last time it was measured. And I did want to point out, I had to make sure that date was right, but the end of April is actually the House deadline to request the public appropriations and finance bills. And we would expect that a statewide school bond proposal would be a public appropriations or finance bill. Leandro, I did just want to mention that the long-term action plan is expected to be filed in Superior Court the beginning of next week. It was expected this week, but then they postponed it for about a week. I did just want to give Dr. Emery another shout out because she has been named the executive director of Leandro implementation. And then I also just wanted to remind you all that there is a court order from September that requires the legislature to come up with a plan to spend about $427 million through this Leandro court case. Also, House Bill 32, I just wanted to mention right quick, and I'm afraid I don't have all the time that I want to go into that, but that bill would actually make changes to the Opportunity Scholarship Program. So if you do have concerns about school choice, make sure you look up House Bill 32. It would change things such as, the amount for the scholarship grant and also changing the personal education savings account to student accounts for children with disabilities. So definitely look at that bill if you are concerned with school choice issues. Moving on, I just wanted to talk briefly about some studies and pilots and reports. that have been filed so far. House Bill 78 and 79 under Internet Access and Digital Learning. Those have actually both been passed fully in the House and are just awaiting action in the Senate. And so House Bill 78, that would require LEAs to submit info on computer science courses, such as, how many courses are you offering? How many teachers do you have? How many students do you have taking those courses? And all that information would be due by September 15th. And then House Bill 79, that would actually require the state board to create a digital learning dashboard that would be updated annually by the public school units. And that would just be a public dashboard that people could see and learn about which districts have access to digital devices and internet connectivity, both on school grounds and at their houses, so outside of school. So I think I've got this one as well, efficient operations and safe learning environment. Not too much here so far. I did just want to point out that a ton of school calendar flexibility bills have been filed. Even more than this, I haven't updated this this week, but I know that even more local bills have been filed. I did mention earlier that calendar flexibility has been kind of become a dirty phrase. So what we kind of like to use now is calendar alignment or community college calendar alignment, just to make it a little bit more, I guess, sellable to the legislature. So we are hoping that they do have some sort of guidance on the upcoming school calendar very soon. And if they're going to make any changes like they did last year, we know it's very important that they pass that legislation if they're going to change anything very quickly, because you guys are finalizing your calendar for next year if your boards haven't already voted on it. Then there's just a few more bills about financial operations and auxiliary services. We did want to note that we are working with Representative Lofton on a bill that would increase resources and have us work with the local boards of education. So just be on the lookout for that bill. Moving into like a safe environment. We haven't really had a specific like school safety bill like we have seen in the past, but we have seen a bunch of different proposals, things like fully fund school social workers and psychologists. I know fully funding school psychologists is on the State Board of Education and the state superintendent's legislative priorities. So we think that might actually be able to go somewhere. A lot of bills have been filed regarding telepsychiatry and just improving access to virtual medical programs and offerings, abuse and neglect resources, and then a lot of, you're always going to see some bills relating to Medicaid. We have had a lot of, or a couple of bills actually have been filed, even though there's only one listed to help children with autism. So we will definitely keep an eye on these bills and let you guys know which ones, I guess, kind of float to the surface, because again, these are all just bills that have been filed. They're not ones that have been passed or, made it through a bunch of committees quite yet. Lastly, I believe this is the last of our legislation, our legislation slides. I just want to mention some school campus safety. So a lot of these, like the fireworks and the sex offender bills, that will have to do with limitations on how far away you are from school property, things like protect religious meeting places and the Second Amendment and the Carry Act. Obviously that has to do with firearms, and a lot of these have to do with schools that also use a church facility. So this is, a lot of these are going to have more of an impact on your private schools and things like that. And I believe that's all. We haven't left you any time for questions. I'm sorry. But we did notice we were getting a lot of questions. So if we weren't able to cover your specific question, please feel free to reach out to us. A lot of you already utilize our emails, and we love that. We love figuring this all out for you. It's been a learning process for us as well. And I'm just going to pass it over to Katherine to see if she has any last minute things to say.
So I will just touch on the final question that I saw in the chat and the Q&A box about, will the school calendar allow an early start? And I know Elizabeth touched on that briefly, but we are hearing pretty much because of the mandatory summer program that we think is going to be pushed into law, that lawmakers are not pursuing an earlier start to next school year. They want time for that summer program this summer, which is really up to each family on whether they participate in that or not. And so we had asked for an August 16th start date for everyone and have not had any support so far in moving that forward. So unfortunately, the answer is we don't think that's going to materialize. So you should be planning your calendars now based on the ongoing school calendar requirements that were in place before the current school year. So that's what you have on the drawing board, and that means August 23rd for most districts, unless you have a weather waiver and can start just a bit earlier than that. So thanks to Elizabeth for helping with this session. And before we move into our lunch break, I have just a few logistics to tell you about. So moving into those, we're going to have coming up, of course, our breakout sessions for this afternoon. It's important to note that if you attended all of yesterday's sessions and participate in all of today's sessions, you're going to be eligible for one continuing education unit. To get that credit, you will need to complete the post-conference evaluation that's going to be emailed out to you later today. So be looking for that and complete the evaluation. We ask that you do that evaluation by the end of next week, March 19th, and then the following week, your CEU certificate will be available to download in your online member portal through the NCASA website. Instructions on how to access that member portal and get that certificate will be included in that post-conference email. So certainly look for that and direct any questions you have toward us. For those attending this conference who are not members, your students through one of our schools of higher education, then Karen Owens of our team is going to be making sure that you get your CEU certificates as well. So don't worry about those. She will be sure to get those out to you. And then also we're getting questions about the PowerPoints and the presentations and recordings. We're going to be making key components of this conference available in our follow-up materials, and it's going to be available only to those of you who were registered for this conference. So look for some of those follow-up materials, PowerPoints like the one we just rolled through with the update. Those will be coming your way very soon. May not be all available in the email going out today, but we'll get those loaded and shared as quickly as we can. Last, but certainly not least, thank you all for coming to this virtual conference on educational leadership and your ongoing support of this organization.